Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History Podcast. In this episode of 10 Questions, we deal with the Roman Republic, the universe of battle. In all of the people we talk about, there are very few, maybe only the Assyrians, who are so shaped by war and conflict and violence. So what is Rome's political geographic situation? Now, up to this point, we've always talked about physical geography, mountains and seas and rivers, but none of that is really important in what we call Italy. What was really important was the cultural layout of Italy. We don't yet have Italians, and that's because Italy was divided into 4 parts. There's a very famous phrase, it's the first phrase that most people who studied Latin learned, and it's from Caesar's commentaries, and it's all Gaul was divided into 3 parts. Caesar's going to describe conquering Gaul, and he starts with not its geography, not the mountains, not the rivers, not the forest. He starts with its political cultural layout. All Gaul, G-A-U-L, all Gaul was divided into 3 parts, while all Italy was divided into 4 parts. So the Romans are born surrounded. The Gauls, the toughest people that the Romans will know, especially in the early days, are in the north. They had come over the mountains. They're foreigners. They had come over the mountains from Gaul, from today, what is today France, invaded northern Italy and settled. And so northern Italy, it makes sense. It's beautiful countryside. It's where Milan is, Venice is, Genoa is. It's beautiful up there. The Italian Riviera is up there. Well, that was dominated by the Gauls, who had all of their connections over the mountains to the north. South of the Romans were the Greeks, who were tough and smart. They had philosophy and the phalanx. And under Alexander, the Greeks had helped conquer the world, all the way to India. So the Greeks in the southern Italy and Sicily were tough and smart and wealthy. North of Rome, right north of Rome, was the Etruscans, an area we call Tuscany today. If you're a fan of the Olive Garden, you know Tuscan food. It still today makes the great Chianti. And the Etruscans were smart, but weak. Now, they had kings, and they were strong enough to own Rome for 100 years. And that servitude of Rome under the Etruscan kings, it completely scars the Romans. For one, Romans hate kings. Just proclaiming yourself to want to be a king could get you murdered in Rome. And that was a justified murder. Regicide, killing of a king, was legal in Rome. Romans hate kings. So the Etruscans are smart. The Romans themselves will say they got most of their early knowledge from the Etruscans. But they're constantly fighting each other. They're weak. They don't have great kings. There is no Ramses II of the Etruscans. They fight each other. In fact, an Etruscan civil war is probably why the Gauls ended up in northern Italy in the first place. They hired them as mercenaries. They came over the mountains. They beat up the other Etruscans. And then the new Etruscan leader was like, hey, okay, go home. And the Gauls said, no, and you can't make us. So the Gauls are in the north. The Etruscans are south of them. The Greeks are in the south. Who's left in that middle, lower part? Those are the Latins. And the Latins are weak and poor. They're not strong. They're not tough. They're not educated. They're not sophisticated. Now, the Latins speak Latin. That's what they have in common, but they have nothing else in common. And Rome was only one small town among many Latin towns. Rome is Latin, but not all Latins were Roman. And so Rome was born surrounded. It was one tiny little town surrounded by other towns that didn't like it very much, surrounded by smart Etruscans, smart and tough Greeks, and way to the north, the toughest people the Romans are going to know, the Gauls, who scared everybody. So the Romans needed to create a system to survive, so that Rome wouldn't be conquered, that Rome wouldn't be owned by somebody else like they had been during the Etruscans. And that starts with the government. Rome's solution to its political geographic problem, to being surrounded, is to form the Republic. The Republic is going to unite the rich and the poor in service to the state. And that's its great advantage. So how was the Republic formed? Well, the Republic is formed by a Brutus. By a Brutus. The guy, Marcus, who will kill Caesar, his great ancestor is going to help lead the revolution, kick out the Etruscan king, and then the Republic. Because they can't have kings. Just like Washington could not be a king. People will go, oh, Washington could have been a king. No, he couldn't. Because the whole point of the American Revolution was to kick out the king. It wasn't to replace one king with another. And so Brutus helps form the Republic. And that is going to be led by the Senate, a group, a council of people. And Senate literally means rich old men, a group of rich old men. It's where we get senior from, senile from, right? Senate means a group of rich old men. And they're going to run the system. And this is the patricians. The patricians are the rich families of Rome, the richest families of Rome. And they get together in the Senate to discuss what Rome should do. And they run it by consensus. They all agree at the end. This is why our Senate doesn't run on a majority. It's supposed to run by consensus. That's where that's where the filibuster comes in to mess with that. But the idea was the majority gets what it wants, the minority gets protections, and the system keeps moving. And Rome gets a decision that everybody agrees to. And so that's the importance of consensus. Now, the patrician class is small. It's like 1% of Romans. So it means they're all interrelated. All these families are interrelated. So they had an interest, a vested interest in working together. Just like our early Senate did. When our early Senate is formed, it's 2 people per state. There's 13 states. There's not even 13 states when the first Senate probably comes together. But there's eventually the first 13 colonies become states. So you have 26 guys who had just fought a revolution. They all knew each other. So of course they go, well, we can decide on things together. We don't have to be like the House, which is full of crazy people. So we'll just decide together as a group. The Roman Senate did the same thing. Okay, well, if the rich people are part of the government and running the show, where are the middle classes? Where are the regular people? And those are the plebeians, Plebian. These are the regular farmers, merchants of Rome. And they're not going to be part of the government. They're going to elect representatives to be part of the government. And those are the tribunes. Rome is going to be divided up into about 12 parts. And the idea is that each of those parts Each of those districts are going to elect a representative, a tribune, Tribunes, who goes to the Senate and sits there and listens to what these senators talk and propose laws, and then acts as a poll, Poll. They act as a poll to tell the senators what the people will accept and what they won't accept. Because the Senate needs that. It needs something that tells them we shouldn't do something. Because if you get a bunch of rich men together to make laws, what's the first law they're going to pass? One that lowers all of their taxes. Well, you need somebody who says, yeah, if you do that, the poor people are going to revolt on you and then murder you. They make up 98% of the population. And so the Senate goes, oh, okay, we'll table that. We'll come back to it later. We'll keep it on the back burner. But we won't make it a law. You need somebody that says, whoa, we don't like that. The people don't like that at all. They need someone to burst the Senate bubble. And the third part is the laws. And the laws are huge. I mean, Rome is two things. Rome is roads and the law. Wherever the Romans go, they bring those two things. They build roads and they spread law. And that is represented in the 12 tables. The 12 tables represented the essential laws and the constitution of Rome. And the innovation of this was it applied all laws to people equally. The plebeians actually had a sit-down strike. There was a war. The Senate voted for a war. They didn't ask the plebeians their opinion. They voted for a war. They called out the army. And the men formed into their ranks. And when the leading senator said, okay, let's go forward to fight the Gauls, they sat down. Literally sat down. And the patricians freaked out. And they said, but we're at war. And the plebeians said, we're not at war. You're at war. Nobody asked us. And the Senate goes, but the Gauls are coming and they're going to steal your stuff. And the plebeians said, we don't have any stuff. You're the rich people. You have stuff. They're coming for your stuff. And so the Senate went, these patricians said, well, what do you want? And they said, you know all those laws that treat you really well? And the senator said, yeah, we like those laws. It's the good part about being a patrician. And the plebeians said, we want those laws to apply to us in the exact same way that they apply to you. And the patrician said, but then we'd all be kind of the same. I would be the same as you, except I just have more money. And the plebeians said, well, we could let the Gauls take all your money and murder you. And the patrician said, yeah, on that hand, we'll take it. And so, unlike the Code of Hammurabi, which treats rich people and poor people differently, the Republic's laws treats all Roman citizens the same. Like our laws do. There is no law that says, if you're rich, this is your penalty. But if you're poor, this is your penalty. Now, like the Romans, did it play out that it worked exactly the same for everybody? No, because richer people could hire lawyers. Richer people might be related to the judge, because the judge is going to be an upper-class patrician, because you have to be educated to know the laws, to sit on the court. So they might know the cousin. They might be cousins with the judge. But it also meant every plebeian could point to a number, one of those 12 tables, could point to a law on those 12 tables and say, that applies to this situation. That applies to me. And it was the same law that applied to everybody equally. And this is going to be huge because people like this. Non-Romans are going to love this because most non-Romans are living in worlds of kings and chiefs and people who say, I have the power and I'm going to use that power. Now, they're going to be treated the same as the rich guys? That's great. So what the Republic does, the great advantage of the Republic is that it gets men to serve the state. All men have to serve the state in order to save it. That was its idea. That was its advantage. It's able to bring people who are farmers and merchants and blacksmiths and rich dudes and make them all give their energy, their knowledge, their futures to helping Rome. All right. So what about women in the Roman Republic? Well, like men, they are given citizenship at birth. They gain rights for responsibilities. So why give it at birth? Why not, like the Greeks, give it after you do something? Because the idea was, we're at war. We don't have time to negotiate this. So we're just going to give it to you when you're born, and then you'll grow into your rights as you get older. And you'll grow into your responsibilities as you get older. And so women had education, marriage veto, right? They couldn't be made to marry someone they don't want to marry. They kept their family name. They didn't have to give up their maiden name. They kept it. They just added their husband's name to it. So the Romans, they wouldn't say this, but their Roman women had a hyphenated name because they kept their family name and added their husband's family name, so that everyone knew what families they belonged to. They had inheritance rights. They had business rights. They could sue in court like a man could. And they served as religious priests. So they're religiously important. So in all of these things, they have these rights like men do. Are they equal to men? No. But do they have rights like men do? Yeah. Yeah, they do. Why? Because women were expected to fill in for their husbands while the men were at war. And so they had to have legal rights to be able to actually stand in for men. If a man runs a business, he owns a business, right? And he's called to serve, to join the army and go north to go fight the Gauls. Right? Who's going to run that business? Well, his wife is going to step in, right? His wife has the education. She can count the numbers. She could maybe be literate enough to write down the records, right? So she's going to order from a wholesaler. What if the wholesaler stiffs her? What if the wholesaler shows up, she buys 100 goats from the wholesaler, and the wholesaler shows up and they're terrible goats. You know, every goat has like 2 legs. And she says, no, you can't give me these goats. These are terrible goats. And he says, well, you're already paid, so tough luck. Ha, 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 ha. You're a woman. What are you going to do? Well, I'm going to write to my husband, who's right now at war in serving with, the army, and he's going to sue you once he comes back down here. Well, imagine what happens. So she writes the letter. It goes up to the army. He gets it. He goes to his commander and goes, I have to leave. I got to go home and deal with this guy who's stiffing my business. Is that going to work? No, of course that's not going to work. That man needs to be in the army. He needs to fight the Gauls. That's his job right now. Later, he can be the goat seller. But right now, he's standing in a line in a legion. So, for this to work, women have to be able to have to have the legal rights of men to stand in for them. So when that guy goes, ha, 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 you're a woman, what are you going to do? She's like, I'm going to sue you because here's the contract that we signed, and this contract's going to be held up in court, and you're going to have to give me the good goats. Or you're going to have to pay me, plus you're going to have to pay me damages for wasting my time. Why? Because Rome was constantly at war for survival. And so, like in World War I and World War II for the United States, women gain rights. Women gain positions. Women step in for men. Kind of the most famous of this is the Rosie the Riveter, where it's a picture of Rosie the Riveter with these giant biceps. She's changed her body. Why is she riveting rivets into steel girders? Why? Because the men are away at war fighting Germany and the Japanese. Somebody had to step in. She stepped in. She's changed her body to do it. She also should have the rights of a man. So she should get paid like a man. Be able to join a union like a man. She should be able to vote for the government like a man. So women gain rights because of the constant war for survival in the Roman Republic. We see this also, we've already talked about this for the Spartan women. Spartan women were the same. The men were at war so often that women were expected to stand in for the men. So Spartan women, unlike Athenian women, had way more rights, way more independence. So how does the Romans fight? Well, they fight in a unit called the legion. That's the military unit of Rome, and they used a sword and a shield. So what's the advantage of the legion? Why would they fight this way? Well, the sword and the shield, if you swing your sword around, you had to space out. You couldn't stand right next to each other, because otherwise you'd hit the guy next to you. So they spaced out. So they formed a rectangle. There's no point in having a square. The square only makes sense if you're shoulder to shoulder. So they became thin and wide. So they were 5 men deep, but 20 men long. What is the advantage of this? Flexibility. With that air between you, with that space between you, think about how you sit in a college classroom or your high school classrooms. That's a legion, because you could get up, you can move up and down the aisle, you could move across aisles, there was space. You have flexibility. You could turn, back up, feint. Phalanxes could only move forward. 2, they were interchangeable. All men could do all jobs equally well. You had to be trained to use the shield because you had to defend yourself. You had to be trained to use the sword because nobody else could fight for you. You had air to your left and air to your right. So you had to be independent, which means you had to be as good as everybody else so that units could be swapped in and swapped out for each other, and individuals could be swapped in and swapped out. And the third advantage is violence. By using a sword, you ended up with very bloody battles. Swords cut things off. They cut hands off, they cut arms off, they cut heads off, they open up bellies and guts come out. Very, very bloody battles. That's how the Assyrians fought. Right? That's how the Assyrians weighed complete waste to other armies. And it scared people because people don't ordinarily fight like that. People are not used to very bloody battles. They use a spear. They keep people far away. They poke. They make a hole in somebody. And while that's, bad for the guy who's dead, he looks like him at the end. He just has a hole in him. And he's bled onto his white tunic. He's made this flower in a flower pattern into the white tunic. All right? And you can bury him. He looks like him. At the end of a Spartan-Athenian battle, all of the dead look like they did right before they murdered each other. A Roman battle, on the other hand, you were burying pieces. You have unknown soldiers. You can't know who's who in a lot of cases. And the Romans were as bloody as the people they defeated, because when you cut things, the blood gets on you too. Now notice during the Empire, they're going to make gladiatorial games. They're going to do this and watch this for fun. These very bloody battles. Other peoples were not used to it. The disadvantage is that it took training to use the sword and the shield well, and there's not always time. So people are sent into battle not knowing how to defend themselves, not knowing how to use the sword together. The second disadvantage is those thin lines. Remember, they're 3 or 5 people deep. Can easily be broken by a phalanx. A phalanx is 8, 16, 32 people deep. It's got punching power. It gets a move. It weighs several tons. Each person plus their armor is like, say, 200 pounds, right? 200 pounds times 300. Just 300 guys. Leonidas's phalanx. You're talking several tons of weight that go boom. It's a battering ram right through people. An elephant, Asian and African elephants, are going to do the same. They're going to just run right through there. The Asian elephants and the African elephants are not there like in the movies. They're going to murder people and step on them and all that. Their job is to poke a hole right through the legion's lines. They break it up. They force the legion to break up into 2 parts, and then those 2 parts can be surrounded, like in our picture if you're watching the video. They can be, into those holes can come Carthaginians, mercenaries, Greeks, Gauls. And then the Romans can't fight together. They're fighting separately, they're fighting individually, and they die. The third disadvantage is the result of those first two disadvantages. The Romans lose battles. But they don't lose wars. They take lots of casualties. Hannibal, in the first 3 battles of the Second Punic War, is going to kill 100,000 Roman men. He's going to kill 10 to 12% of all Roman men in 3 battles in 1 year. The Romans lose battles, but they don't lose wars. But they're going to take lots of casualties. And so they constantly need more men. They need more Roman farmers. They need more Roman merchants. But you're going to run out of those people pretty quickly if you keep losing battles. Look at the Athenians. The Athenians lasted 30 years of the Peloponnesian War. How is Rome going to last? How is the Roman Republic going to last 500 years? They're going to need more men who are not Romans. So what is the cultural innovation that Romans use to help them win these wars? If they're losing battles, but they win wars, how do they win these wars? And the answer is a concept called natio. And if you're watching the video, that's our gladiator. That's Russell Crowe in Gladiator. Now, he's in the Empire. He's not in the Republic. But Russell Crowe is not a Roman born in Rome. In fact, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius tells him, says it, you have never even seen Rome. Why do you fight for it? He's called the Spaniard. He's from Spain. Now, in our situation right now, Spain is not yet part of the Roman Republic, but it will be. And in 600 years, Russell Crowe will be a general from Spain, fighting in Roman armies. Why? Natio, N-A-T-I-O, where we get nationality from, nationhood from. Natio is the concept that anyone can be a Roman citizen if you act like a Roman and you fight for Rome. That should sound familiar because that's us. That's the United States of America. And we're pretty much the only country that does this. Anyone can be a Roman citizen if you act like a Roman and you're willing to fight for Rome. Now, no one else in the ancient world was really willing to do this. Even the Greeks with their democracy. Athens doesn't want other people to be Athenian. They made it very hard to be an Athenian. The Spartans made it almost impossible to be a Spartan. The Spartans make it so hard, the Spartans run out of men. The Spartans never have a lot of manpower. Never. Their population is always small. They don't have enough babies. They rely on allies a lot of the time, but they're not willing to make those allies into Spartans, to give those allies Spartan rights. So there's always this arm's length. The Assyrians weren't willing to do that, except to a very small group of people who fought for them, of specialists. The Persians weren't willing to do this. The Persians were willing to hire everybody, but you had to be born a Persian to be a Persian. So nobody else was willing to do this because when you do that, when you share your rights, you dilute your rights. The more people who can vote in an election means your vote counts for less. And take a look at the American history of voting and the American history of its fights of immigration, of who gets to be an American and who gets to be an American citizen and who gets to be a voting American citizen. There's been 275 years of fighting over that. It's the one constant. because we started, as Lincoln says, right? We started by declaring all men are created equal, as Thomas Jefferson wrote. But then, as Lincoln points out, we practically read it now as all men are created equal except for natives, Africans, and Catholics. Right? There was always like, you're not really one of us. You're not in the club. The Romans were willing, through Natio, to bring in new people and make them Roman. It allowed Rome to turn Latins and Etruscans and even Gauls, the hated nemesis Gauls, into Romans. It created loyalty. It was able to tap the manpower. It was able to bring in defeated peoples. The idea was winning matters more. And we see this most positively when people do not revolt during Hannibal's invasion during the Second Punic War. Hannibal crushes 3 Roman armies in Italy. Crushes them, kills them all, kills everybody in them. Like I said, 100,000 people. He goes to the walls of Rome. Now, he doesn't have the artillery. He doesn't have the siege engines to take it down because he crossed the Alps in winter with elephants. But the whole idea was, we don't need to do that. We'll surround Rome and we'll wait for the Italians, the Latins, the Etruscans, and the Gauls to rise in rebellion. And then, like the Medes and the Persians and the Babylonians and the Judeans and the Egyptians who rose up against Assyria, they'll all come to the capital, we'll have a giant battle, and we'll murder all the Romans. It'll be over, and then everyone gets to be free again. And everyone can do their own thing. And the Etruscans and the Latins and the Gauls looked at Hannibal and said, yeah, we don't want that. We want to be Roman. And Hannibal said, why would you want to be Roman? He's like, well, they give us rights and they give us stuff, and we get voting and we get the laws pertain to us. It's actually good to be a Roman. And I was like, well, I can't offer you that. I can't make you a Carthaginian citizen. That's crazy. Why would I do that? And so they never rose in revolt against the Romans. In fact, they'll join the new armies that will eventually fight in Spain and then fight in Africa and then eventually defeat Hannibal 20 years later. But if the Romans didn't have Natio, they would never have been the Roman Empire. They would never have become the Romans. In fact, if the United States didn't have Natio, the same kind of Roman concept, we would not be the United States. Do you realize the United States is the 3rd most populous country in the entire world? The 3rd. First is China. Next is India, though that probably in the next couple of years will change. And then there's us at 3. But remember, nobody lived in what is the United States in 1800. There were a couple million Europeans living along the coast, and then there was a few million Native Americans living in the interior. Like, we did not start with 300 million people. We took them in from all over the world. Oh, and to be fair, there was another 500,000 enslaved Africans, people of African descent as well. Excuse me for leaving them out. So you start the United States with 3 continental cultures from the very beginning. So what about the Punic Wars? Well, the Punic Wars are a titanic struggle of 3 wars for who will dominate the Western Mediterranean. It's fought between Rome and Carthage. Carthage is a merchant city. It's Phoenician and Greek. It's originally a Phoenician city, but it will Hellenize. It will become Greek cultured after Alexander conquers Persia, and Greek becomes the best, most civilized culture in the world. So the Carthaginians are Hellenized Phoenicians living in North Africa. And they own or ally with the peoples of North Africa, of the coast of North Africa, and parts of Spain. They are richer than Rome. They are more sophisticated than Rome. They have a navy. The Romans don't have a navy. The Romans get seasick looking at a rubber ducky in a bathtub. The Romans want nothing to do with the sea. But they get into a fight with each other over Sicily, over southern Italy. And really, it's just the two biggest dogs on the block. Like they were going to fight eventually over the Western Mediterranean. Because Rome is constantly worried about being conquered. And so it can't allow anyone else of significance to challenge it. So there's an old saying that Rome never fought an offensive war. Rome never attacked anybody. They always fought out of defense to protect themselves. That's not true. That's nowhere near true. But the Romans said it. The Romans felt it. And that's the Punic Wars. And you just have to go to the Third Punic War to see that that's a completely offensive war done to conquer territory and people. That's not in any way. Carthage, by the Third Punic War, is not in any way a threat to Rome. But why? Why is Carthage, after 2 wars, not a threat? Why are they the greatest enemy of Rome? So much so that we know Hannibal's name as one of the great generals of all time. Like the Gauls are scary, but you don't know any of the Gauls chiefs from Cisalpine Gaul. You know Hannibal, though. You study any Roman history, you know Hannibal. You know he crossed the Alps on elephant. You know that because it's in Jeopardy. It's a Jeopardy quiz. They don't ask about Cisalpine Gaul chiefs. They ask about Hannibal. So why? Why did the Carthaginians come so close to destroying the Romans? And why, by the Third War, are they completely incapable of stopping the Romans at all? And the answer is the Romans had to change. The Romans had to evolve. And these 3 wars show that the Romans are willing to change. And the Romans are willing to evolve in order to win. And remember, most people don't do that. The ancient world is conservative. There is not really a good liberalism, really until the French Revolution, or at least to the Reformation, or maybe the Renaissance, if you want to be very kind of liberal in your progressivism kind of definition. But liberal politics is really, let's be honest, the French Revolution. People liked stability. Day in, day out, they were farmers. They liked the predictability of every year being essentially the same. See Egypt, right? Every year the river floods. It's great. So most cultures would rather lose than change. Rome changes. So to defeat Carthage's navy in the First War, which took 20 years from 260 to 240 BCE, they had to build a navy themselves and learn how to sail it. They had to build industries that could cut down the wood, that can build ships, that can maintain those ships, that could build ports. Romans don't have these ports for trade, for bringing ships in, for the dry docks. They need to be able to tap manpower. It's 20 years of conflict. So they're going to run out of eligible men pretty quickly. They have to learn, having conquered Sicily, you have to learn how to run it. Everybody they ran before was within a couple of, day or two, a couple of days of horseback. Sicily's across the sea. It's not far from southern Italy, but now you need a navy to get there. So they had to change, build industries, become economically more sophisticated, be able to get more people, remember Natio, to fight for Rome. And then they had to learn how to run a little e empire. They had to learn how to run people who weren't Italian who weren't Roman. What about the Second War? Well, this is this World War II. This is the great conflict of the Romans. This is the biggest conflict the Romans are going to fight ever. They're going to have to mobilize 1 million men into the army. Like, think about how crazy that is. Alexander's army at its largest, and he's hiring all the mercenaries of the Persian Empire, was maybe 100 to 150,000 total. The Romans are going to put 1 million men under arms. They had to be able to do that in order to defeat Hannibal. So to defeat Hannibal in the Second War, which takes place from 218 to 202, you had to know when not to fight Hannibal. You had to learn tactics. You had to learn strategy. You can't just send the first 3 armies Hannibal defeats. We're just sent. Go defeat Hannibal. Okay, let's go. Boop, 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 and Hannibal just crushes them. He surrounds one at the Battle of Cannae, Cannae. His army is half, if not 2/3 smaller than the Romans. He surrounds the Romans. You can't do that in war. A smaller force can't surround a larger force. The larger force should be able to break out. It didn't. He surrounded the larger force, and they were murdering, by one estimate, 800 Romans a minute. 80 senators go down fighting. Hannibal wore the rings that senators wore. He had the rings cut off the dead men's fingers and then wore it as a necklace, so he jangled on his war elephant. Hannibal was, and there's no other way to put this, badass. He is the baddest ass guy the Romans will ever fight. And that's the Romans telling us that. The Romans later on make a myth out of Hannibal. He kills 100,000 Romans in Italy. So what do? You don't fight Hannibal in Italy. You have to fight in Spain. You have to fight in Africa. You have to fight the allies of Carthage. You have to fight to control the gold mines that are feeding the Carthaginian state with the taxes that can then pay for the mercenaries. You have to fight wars by other ways. Very Sun Tzu, right? Don't fight battles. You win wars. You fight a battle only after you've already won, right? So you have to learn how to build alliances, operate armies overseas. You had to learn how to be a superpower, just like the United States did after World War II. Think about all the ways the United States had to change. It had to send an army from America across the sea, millions of men, ships, submarines, planes, food, money, pay, clothes, and then fight in France. That's crazy. That's the Romans were doing the same. The Third War, from 149 to 146, notice it got short, was about terror and enslaving and profit, murder and genocide. It reflects the evils of power. The Romans were so powerful that they sent an army, lay siege to Carthage, and the Carthaginians are like, what do we do? What did we do? We didn't do anything. We're just a town. We're just a city. We have no empire. We have no fight with you, Rome. What did we do that's wrong? And the Romans said, you exist. So they destroyed the city, tore down its walls. The Romans will tell us they plowed the fields with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again. Well, since Carthage becomes a great city again, that's unlikely, but still, the Romans want to tell you that's what they did. And they sold 50,000 people into slavery in a day. They committed a genocide. There were Carthaginians, and then there were no Carthaginians. That's what the Romans did. That's what they'll attempt to do to the Hebrews. They'll destroy Jerusalem, tear down its walls, destroy the temple, pick up the Jews in Judea, and scatter them. The idea would be, like the Assyrians did to the ancient Israelites, to make them assimilate and make them disappear, to commit a genocide. So the Romans, by the Third Punic War, show that they can be mean. that they could abuse their power. Well, what are the results of the conquest of the Roman Republic? Well, the conquest of Italy and Spain equaled mineral wealth and human resources, i.e. slaves. But not only just slaves, but free people who were willing to work for the Romans, who were willing to become Roman. So that's why it's human resources instead of just enslaved peoples. So mineral wealth, human labor. The conquest of Greece brought culture and sophistication, especially Athenian culture. The Romans are going to privilege Athenian culture. Remember, Athens became a university town? This is where it paid off several hundred years later, because the Romans are going to be very impressed by the Greeks. They know the Greeks are much smarter than them. And they feel that the Athenians are the smartest of the Greeks. So they're going to pick up, literally, Pompey is going to pick up a literal Greek theater. They're just going to carve it out of the earth and plop it on a boat and send those boats just in pieces back to Rome and then put it together like Lego blocks. They didn't build their own. Pompey did not say, we should have a Greek theater. Let's build a Greek theater. They just took a Greek theater, picked it up, and shipped it back to Rome. So you get empire, this connection that spreads from Asia Minor, from the Euphrates to the Atlantic. Roads that are going to connect everything, because the army's going to have to go places, and it doesn't really like to go by sea. Remember, the Romans will build a navy. They're not an ocean-going people. They just aren't. So you get roads that connect everybody. And these roads, unlike the Persian roads, are meant for people to use. It's meant for the army to use. And what people figure out is if the army's not using it, how about I put a cart on it? How about I use it for trade? How about I travel? I go see stuff. I vacation. Or I go and immigrate. You get the assimilation of cultures. The result of the conquest of the Roman Republic is Rome got rich. You have world trade, and you have an unmatched military power. As I said, the Romans could put 1 million men under arms. Not all of those people were born in Rome, but that 1 million men had Roman citizenship, or would have Roman citizenship pretty soon. So Rome changes from a small, poor Latin city into a cosmopolitan superpower. So what happened to the Roman plebeians when Rome got rich? Obviously, the Roman plebeians are doing great, right? Rome got rich. They should get rich too, right? No. The exact opposite happened. The bringing in of slave labor, all those slaves were cheap labor, allowed for the creation of Roman plantations. See, the Roman rich owned property before, but they couldn't own that much property because you didn't have the manpower. You had to pay Romans to farm it. Now you don't. Now you don't have to pay for labor. You could have Carthaginian slaves, Spanish slaves, French slaves, Gaulic slaves. And so you get these plantations with 10,000 enslaved peoples on them, working with threat of violence against them. You get the mines in Spain that are overwhelmingly run by slave labor. So you get cheap food, cash crops, cheaper goods. The plebeians can't compete with that with their small farm of 20 or 50 acres. They got one horse. They got 20 acres. They have to eat most of that. So they can't make any money. The patrician class got super rich because they were able to tap into world economies of scale. The bigger you are, the richer you are. And so the patricians could buy wine from Greece and sell it at a profit in Italy. They can own thousands of acres of olive trees in Greece or Asia Minor, making olive oil using slave labor. A farmer of wheat in Italy couldn't do that. He had to eat most of he and his family had to eat most of what he produced. And the little left over, they could save or sell. But what they found was that wasn't worth anything because the patricians were able to tap into this world market, world resources, world money that plebeians couldn't do. That's very us. That's very 20th century. The patricians get auctoritas. It's a Latin concept, a Roman concept of authority, where we get authority from, but it means more than authority. It means leadership. It means respect. It's the ability to say something. There used to be in the 80s a commercial called When E.F. Hutton Speaks, People Listen. It was for financial advice. So E.F. Hutton was like an early hedge fund kind of company type of thing. And it's when they speak, people listen. That's auctoritas. It's people, it's not just authority, like you yell and people do stuff. It's the respect of other people. It's the leadership. It's you walk in and people turn their heads. And the patricians have that because they won. They conquered the world. They conquered Italy, then Spain, then Africa, North Africa, then Greece, then parts of Asia Minor. They won. They are glorifying in the victory. Nobody in 700 BC could have predicted what Rome would be like in 100 BC. But the plebeian farmers were wiped out. They couldn't compete. Their farms had been destroyed by Hannibal. Their horses were taken by Hannibal. Their pigs were eaten by Hannibal's armies. So they end up unemployed, on welfare. They have to sell their land to the patricians who create the plantations. Those plantations, those 10,000 acre plantations didn't exist before. But what were they able to do? They were able to buy 20 acres here, 50 acres here, 100 acres here. And they put them together and boom, now you've got an economy of scale. So the plebeians lacked dignitas, which is going to be the most important. If patricians care about auctoritas, 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 the plebeians care about dignitas, dignity, pride, the ability to hold your head up and say, civitas Romanus, I am a Roman citizen. The ability to run as a tribune, the ability to vote for your tribune, the ability to take a patrician to court and have the court fined for you. And then the patrician pay their fine. Now you can't do that because the patricians are so protected by their own money. The only thing about a patrician you know is the dust that they leave as their cart goes by you on the road. So they're unhappy. And that unhappiness turns to anger. We won. I won. I defeated Hannibal. I was at Zama, Z-A-M-A, in North Africa, outside the spires of Carthage, outside the walls of Carthage. I defeated Hannibal. But what did I win? What did I get? I don't feel like I won. My life is worse than before. And now that I'm unemployed and on welfare, do you think I'm getting respect from other Romans? From other people? No. On the food line, people are walking by yelling, get a job. You're such a waste. The lack of dignitas, the lack of the ability to hold your head up high, the lack of being an independent, free citizen. So when you have so many people unhappy, so many people angry at their status, in a republic, in a voting republic, somebody's going to show up to promise them stuff, to promise them dignity. And that's the Gracchi. The Gracchi become populari, where we get populist from. They're patricians. They're rich guys. And they realize that they don't have a lot of auctoritas because they're not part of these great families that are so jacked into world trade. How can they get auctoritas? By being a champion of the people, by going to the people and say, vote for my tribunes, vote for my guys who will support me in the Senate versus those rich guys. Those rich guys, they hate you. And Donald Trump did this. Donald Trump did this in 2016 very well. He said, they hate you. These rich elites hate you. And how do I know? Because I'm a rich elite. I know they hate you because they tell me they hate you because I'm a rich elite. I am going to use my elite status to help you smash the rich elite. That's why in 2016, 2015, 2016, Trump was called a populist. Because that was the message he was sending. He was forget the Republican Party. They suck. They're selling you down the river. Forget the conservative donors. Forget big business. They all hate you. The only one you can rely on is me. And that's the Gracchi. The Gracchi start that idea. So rather than working within the system, by negotiating in the Senate, by working with other senators, by marrying into business, they went to the people promising stuff. And they say, first thing is, your vote's going to count for more. Why should the Senate have all the power? Maybe their tribunes should be able to make laws. Maybe we should have more democracy. You should vote for more stuff. Well, that's going to scare the Senate, right? The Senate has for 500 years run the show. Now, here come the Gracchi saying, maybe people should have more of a say than just being a poll. Also, we're going to break up the plantations. Now, they don't start there, but that's the clear, they start with, we're going to use public land. But all the patricians know they're eventually coming for their land. And the idea is to break up these 10,000 acre plantations and give everybody, all these plebeians, 50 acres, 100 acres that they can work. They're not going to give them 1,000 acres. You can't work that. But a couple horses, maybe an ox, and boom. This is very Bernie Sanders. This is very universal basic income. If we give everybody 100 acres, then they have the income of 100 acres of land. Now you have to give them horses and mules and an ox in order to actually use that 100 acres. If you just give them 100 acres and nothing else, that doesn't work. So notice the African-American Civil War saying 40 acres and a mule. It was the idea of you break up these rich people's plantations in the South and you give the land to ex-slaves, to freed people, and what do you give them? 40 acres, which is enough for a person to live on, but you also give them a mule so that they can use that for plowing. You can use that to hook up a cart and go to the market, that you have that independence. So this is what the Gracchi are promising. They're going to make Rome again. Rome is already great, but there's a lot of people looking around going, it's not like it was in Cincinnatus's day, about 450 BC. Rome has changed. In Cincinnatus's day, Cincinnatus is Washington. And there are, in fact, two major statues. One's in the Smithsonian. I think the other is in the Library of Congress that sculpt Washington as Cincinnatus. There's a book, I think, called America's Cincinnatus, and it's Washington. Washington is clearly Cincinnatus. He was a well-respected farmer who, during one of the wars, I think against the Gauls, the Senate's doing badly, it's not going well, so the people come to him and go, Cincinnatus, we respect you. You run the armies. You save us from the Gauls. And so Cincinnatus famously puts down his plow, picks up his sword, goes off, leads the armies, wins, comes back to the Senate, hands back his sword, goes back to being a farmer. Washington famously did that after the Revolution. He came to Philadelphia, went to Congress, and gave back his commission and said, I am no longer a general. I am no longer leader of the armies. I'm just a private citizen. So the Gracchi are promising not to make Rome great. Rome is great. They're promising to make Rome the Rome you remember. The Rome it used to be before the rich got really rich. Before there were giant plantations, before all these slaves were doing work. When you had a farm and you were happy and your wife respected you and your kids respected you. And so he's hugely popular with the plebeian people. They want dignitas. And that's exactly what the Gracchi are promising. They're promising the economic wherewithal to give you back your dignity. And that scares the conservatives elite who like their wealth, who like their Greek education, who like their auctoritas. They like telling the plebeians what to do and having the money to back it up. So what happens next? Does Rome go back to being Rome again? Does Rome in 100 BC go back to being 450 BC? Does Tiberius Gracchi become the new Cincinnatus? No. The Senate murders them. Notice, we're going to come back to this later. The Senate murders them. And so Rome will not constitutionally reform. It tells all the reformers, you will get nothing here. If you try to change Rome from what it is now, super rich patricians running the show, we will murder you. So the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and Rome will not reform. So since Rome will not reform, what happens? Well, you still have that large population of unemployed people on welfare, plebeians, who have military experience and nothing to do. And you have these super rich young guys who have no auctoritas because they haven't been in a war. They haven't led, they aren't a general. They aren't winners, but they have the money. And so young, super rich patricians who want to make their names as a somebody hire private armies and go off to fight private wars. So you have Marius in North Africa, Pompey in the Levant, in Syria, Phoenicia, and Judea. You have Caesar in Gaul, in what is today France. And these young patricians win these wars, and the plebeian soldiers gain dignity, gain dignitas, but only from that patrician, not from Rome as a whole. The young patricians gain authoritas, their soldiers gain dignitas for working with them, but the Rome, the Senate, the Constitution all loses legitimacy. They all lose loyalty. If I'm a plebeian soldier, I don't care about the Senate. I care about Caesar. I care about Pompey. I care about Marius. I care about the guy who's paying my bills. I'm fighting for him. I'm not fighting for Rome. Rome wants me unemployed and on welfare, where my wife doesn't respect me and is having an affair with like the local baker because like the baker has a job and owns a business, and my kids think I'm a loser because I talk about the glory days of when I won, when I defeated Hannibal. But you know who respects me? Marius respects me. He's made me an officer. He's doubled my pay. When I come home, I'm victorious. I have a percentage of the money from Jugurtha's empire that I just conquered. Thank you very much. That I could spread around. I could buy that baker's business, but I won't. Why? Because my wife doesn't want anything to do with him anymore, because she's with me now because I am awesome. My kids think I'm the coolest dad in the neighborhood. And I have the uniform, and I have the money to prove it. And I have Marius to thank for it. I have Pompey to thank for it. I have Caesar to thank for it. Not Rome, not the Senate. So what destroys the Roman Republic? 100 years of civil wars and terrorism. The Senate loses all authority. Why? Well, if you have young men with private armies rolling around the world, conquering stuff, getting rich, and then they come back to Rome and want to be the number one, what happens when two of them show up at the same time? Is Rome big enough for two number ones? And the answer is no. So Sulla is going to fight with Marius, and Sulla is going to defeat Marius, and then use terror against the Senate to loot the patricians, to pay for taking over Rome, to pay his army off. So Sulla is a thug and a terrorist. But he did something the Gracchi were never going to do. The Gracchi were never going to make hit lists. They were never going to make assassination lists. They were never going to go to the courts and say, all right, these guys are traitors to Rome. Let's murder them, so that you could confiscate their land and pay off the army. That's what Sulla does. He defeats Marius in battle, and then he gets the loyalty of his army. He maintains the loyalty of his army by using terrorism against all the rich guys who didn't like him. Caesar will defeat Pompey. The same kind of, now a generation passes, Sulla will die. Rome kind of goes back to the Senate, kind of being like, okay, I guess we'll run things now. But what you get is the triumvirate, Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey running the show. Pompey's got the name, Crassus has the money, Caesar's the young dude with like an aspiring future, right? But Crassus is killed when he goes to fight the Parthians because he needed auctoritas. He didn't have it. He was rich, but no auctoritas. And so when he goes off to fight the Parthians surrounded his army in the middle of a desert. They were horse people and the Romans were not. They surrounded his army in the middle of the desert and just shot it to pieces with bows and arrows. Caesar and Pompey will eventually have it out, and Caesar will defeat Pompey. Pompey will be murdered by Cleopatra's younger brother's henchmen in Egypt when Pompey flees to Egypt and goes, "Oh, Egypt, my friend away from Rome. I'm so glad I'm here." And they're like, "Thank you, Pompey. We heard you lost, and Caesar's on his way here, right?" And Pompey's like, "Well, yeah, that's kind of true." And so they take Pompey and cut his head off and then present it to Caesar. And Caesar's mad, which freaks out the Egyptians. They were like, wait, we did you a favor. And Caesar's like, you don't get to kill a Roman tribune and consul. Only I get to kill a Roman tribune and consul. And the Egyptians are like, but you hate him. We were doing you a favor. And Caesar's like, no, you're nobodies. You're Egyptian nobodies. And then Cleopatra literally rolled up. Cleopatra comes to Caesar. She's in a fight with her brother over who will run Egypt. And her brother's like 13, and she's obviously older. And she comes rolled up in a rug. And what happens is they bring this rug in, and Caesar's sitting there in Alexandria. And it's like, what the hell is this? And like, it's a present for you. And they unroll, they flip the rug, and out comes, boo, Cleopatra. And she's like, hello, Caesar. And he's like, whoa, I am in trouble now. Yeah, Caesar never stood a chance. Caesar did not seduce Cleopatra. Cleopatra easily seduced Caesar. And what will happen? Well, Caesar will have a son, Caesarion, with Cleopatra. So he doesn't need to conquer Egypt. This will be a theme later. He doesn't need to conquer Egypt, because his son will one day inherit Egypt. Well, his son will inherit Egypt if Cleopatra becomes pharaoh, which means Cleopatra's brother has to disappear. And that's exactly what happened. Caesar goes back home. He leaves Cleopatra in Egypt. He leaves his mistress, Cleopatra, in Egypt. He leaves his son. He's like, this is going to be great. I don't even have to do anything with Egypt. It's awesome. The richest place in the whole wide world, and my son's going to run it. It's going to be awesome. He gets back to Rome. He says, hey, Rome, I got to go to the Senate. I got to go see those senators. They're my friends, and I'm going to lead them because I'm cool, and I'm going to wear purple because, that's the cool guy's colors. Like kind of a rich guy who does whatever he wants. I'm not a king, but it's an off purple. And he shows up and he's murdered by the Senate conservatives. But Caesar's army still remains. And Brutus and Cato and the other Senate conservatives basically bet that when they murdered Caesar, his army would just go like, well, okay, and just go home. They didn't. They were loyal to Caesar because Caesar had been paying them. They weren't loyal to Rome anymore. They weren't loyal to the Constitution. They were loyal to a man because that man had given them dignity. had given them victory, had given them money. And so what they did was they turned and looked for a new Caesar, a new commander. And there were two. There was Octavian, Caesar's young heir, and his nephew. Caesar didn't have a son. He didn't have a son to leave power to. So he had a nephew, Octavian. But Octavian's like 18 years old. He's never been a commander in battle. He's nobody. He's green. He's the natural heir. He claims to be the new Caesar. He inherits Caesar's property and money. But if you're a military guy who knows that if you fight another civil war, and another civil war is definitely coming, and you got to fight other Romans, do you really want to be led by a dude who's barely out of diapers? Who's barely out of his boy's tunic? Like, do you really want to be led by that guy? Is that a good life expectancy plan for you? Or do you want to be led by Marc Antony, Caesar's glorious lieutenant, a man with victories, a man with charisma? And so what happens is the Caesar's army breaks in half, essentially. It breaks into parts. Half goes with Octavian because he is Caesar's heir. He is the natural born heir. He is Caesar's nephew, and family ties matter in Rome. But the other half go to Marc Antony, and they're like, Marc Antony, you're a winner. And Marc Antony said, let's go to Egypt. Let's go beat those Parthians who killed Crassus. And the army goes, that'd be cool. You mean we don't have to fight a civil war against Octavian and get murdered? And he's like, no, we could go get rich. And the army's like, great, let's go to Egypt, the greatest place in the whole wide world. So they go to Egypt, where Cleopatra is sitting there being like, so Caesar's dead, eh? And Marc Antony's like, yeah, he's dead. So, and Cleopatra's like, well, what's the plans for Egypt with Caesar being dead? And Marc Antony's like, well, I don't know what the plans are. I have an army, and I'm here. And I'm going to Parthia, so I hadn't really thought about it. And Cleopatra's like, well, how about you come over tonight? And I have a great view of the Nile, and we'll talk about it into the evening. Marc Antony's like, sure, I could do that. You were pretty hot when I was here the last time, and so, that'd be kind of cool. And so Cleopatra seduces Marc Antony. Cleopatra will have 2 children with Marc Antony. So Marc Antony has no desire to conquer Egypt. He's got kids. He figures his kids will take over. He's going to keep Caesarion around as his heir to he's not he's a bastard. He's not the son of Caesar's wife. But he's still got Caesar's blood in him. And so Marc Antony's going to keep him around as an ally to rally some Romans. And Octavian is going to use Marc Antony's seduction by Cleopatra against him. He's going to start saying Marc Antony has gone Egyptian. Marc Antony has gone pharaoh. Marc Antony wants to be a god. Like, Marc Antony tattoos his eyelids, in an Egyptian way. He starts dressing Egyptian. He loves this stuff. He loves being treated like pharaoh. And Cleopatra's perfectly willing to be my pharaoh. We could run Egypt together. And with Egypt's money, we could run the world together. But the Romans were too conservative to wanna, they were fine with other people becoming Roman. They did not want Rome to become Egyptian or Greek Egyptian. Because remember, Cleopatra is descended from a Greek general who was one of Caesar's commanders. She's Greek. So there's a civil war, and at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, it's a naval battle off the coast of Greece. Octavian wins. He wins the naval battle. Cleopatra flees to Egypt. Mark Antony escapes, flees after him. Octavian's hitman quick on his heels. Anthony's like, all right. I was defeated, but I could rally my troops. My troops love me. Octavian went to Antony's troops and said, I will pardon you all. No harm, no foul. How about you join my army? And they all said, oh, it's not getting better than this. And they joined Octavian's army. So Antony's now stuck. He writes to Cleopatra and says, Cleopatra, how about you raise an Egyptian army and together we can, and she's like, yeah, I've got you on block now. Talk to the hand. I don't know who you mean by Cleopatra. Like, I'm out of the office forever. And so Antony commits suicide. Because now without Cleopatra, by being ghosted by Cleopatra, he's got nothing. So sooner or later, he's just going to be hunted down and murdered by Octavian's hit squads. Actually, he's probably not going to be murdered. He's going to be captured and brought to Rome and put on trial, which is even more humiliating. So he just commits suicide in a manly kind of way. In fact, the story is he stabs himself and he's dying, and the people come to him and say, they go to Cleopatra and they're like, Antony's dying. He's stabbed himself. And they're like, oh, no, I love him. Bring me to him. And so Cleopatra and Antony are brought back together, and he's dying, and she's holding him in her arms, and they're like, I could have run the world with you. And she's like, I know, but Rome is not worth Alexandria, and Egypt's better than that. You could have stayed here with me forever. And he's like, I would have liked that, and dies. Oh. And then Octavian's army shows up. His navy shows up in Alexandria. She gets on a boat. She goes up the Nile River. She's fleeing. She tries to seduce Octavian. She sends letters to Octavian. Hey, you're manlier than your uncle was, and you're definitely manlier than Marc Antony was. You're definitely the manliest Roman I've ever met. How about we get together? I have a place that has a nice view of the Nile, and when the moon's over, you could see the pyramids. And he's like, nope. No. You're evil. You're an evil woman. You're an evil woman who wants to seduce me, and I cannot be seduced. I am made of stone. I have no feelings whatsoever. I love Rome. So faced with that, Cleopatra commits suicide, because otherwise she's going to be captured, brought to Rome, put on trial as an enemy of Rome, and that's going to end badly. So she commits suicide, and so she dies. Which means Octavian is the last army standing, and so he has Imperium. He has all the power. There is nobody left. There's no other private armies. There's not the Senate. There's no one in the Senate who objects to him. There's not Marc Antony. He's going to have Caesar's heir, son Caesarion, murdered. Weirdly, he's going to take Marc Antony's kids with Cleopatra and give them to his sister to raise, which is kind of the most interesting thing about Octavian as a person. Like, there's a lot about Octavian that's like, he's a great leader, but he's like kind of Washington in a way. He's a great leader, but he's not approachable. He's like this man of stone. But this is the one thing where you're like, oh, that's interesting, because Octavian loves his sister. Maybe there's a thing there, but probably not. But who knows? But the woman of his life, even though he's going to marry somebody else and he's going to have a daughter, but the woman of his life really is Octavia, his wife. And who was married to Marc Antony at one point. She was also married to Pompey at one point. So there's a lot going on for Octavia. Was through some stuff. We should have a class just on the Roman women and what they had to go through. But Octavian's going to take these two young children, who were the children of his enemy, his children of his nemesis, and give them to his sister to raise as if they are her own, even though they are the children of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. So there's something to Octavian. There's something to him there, because you could have just murdered the children, and he doesn't. He could have sent them to Spain or Portugal and let them leave history. Give them to some Arabian prince across the Red Sea. Gone. They're gone. They'll never appear in history again. He doesn't. He gives them to his sister. And so what we're left with is Octavian's Roman Empire, big E. One man to rule them all. The Roman Republic had an empire, little e. Octavian has the Roman Empire, big E. And that ends the 500 years of the Roman Republic and will replace the Roman Republic, the Senate, the tribunes, this elected, it's not a democracy at all. There's no democracy in it. But electoral government, empire, and an emperor who doesn't care what the people want to vote for. He cares what they care about. He cares with keeping them on his side. But their votes don't matter. He is going to run the show. All right. I know this is a long episode, but it's 500 years of the Roman Republic in one episode. So be safe, be good, take care, and I'll see you soon. In our next episode, we do the Roman Empire.